So if you can believe it, it has been 23 years since the movie Titanic came out. An entire generation has been born and come through who never saw it in the wild, but I can claim to the truth that I am old enough that I remember seeing Titanic, and I remember the amazing hoopla that really took over the whole country and really the world when that movie came out. And today, it's one of the movies that more people have seen than any other movie. So I feel confident, hopefully, that most folks sitting here today have seen Titanic at some point in their lives. Who's with me? Who has seen Titanic? Okay, we know this movie. And so you know that one of the most famous parts of the movie, and it's on many, many of the posters of the movie, is this scene where Jack and Rose, who are our lovebirds, are at the bow of the Titanic ship. And Jack has Rose climb up on the railing. Now, keep in mind, railings are there for a reason. He has her climb up on the railing, and then he climbs up behind her, and in this great moment of trust, he asks her those famous words, "Rose, do you trust me?" And in that moment, she releases her arms and spreads them wide and is flying hundreds of feet over the churning ocean below because she trusts him. Now, maybe I'm afraid of heights or something, but I remember seeing that. I was 12 years old when Titanic came out, and I remember seeing that and just being horrified because I noticed what most people don't notice, which is that Jack had climbed up on the railing too. He was not spotting her from the ground in any really good way that I would be spotted. He was up there too, and so they're both just holding on at the top of that railing, and yet she trusts him completely, and everyone oohs and ahs, and I was probably the only person in the theater who in my head was silently screaming when he asked, "Do you trust me?" No. Because trust is an interesting thing, isn't it? Whom we trust and whom we don't. The when and the where of trust. And a lot of us approach trust very, very differently. Some of us trust way too much. And when we trust too much, we can often get hurt, get bruised, get burned by people or situations that just let us down again and again and again. And some of us, though, trust too little. And trusting too little can be just as bad. When we trust too little, we isolate ourselves and we don't end up having deep and meaningful relationships with other people, with God, with our communities. And as organizations, we can really slow our growth when we don't trust enough. So how should we trust? When's the right time to trust? How do we trust just the right amount? Well, at its heart, the story of David and Goliath is really a story all about trust. Now, on one level, it's obvious. David trusts God. He has this amazing firmness of faith. He knows that God will protect him, and then sure enough, he does. He wins the day. Message is clear. Trust in God. Okay, great. But there's another level to this story as well. And it's a little more complicated, but I think it's super interesting. And it's a level about trusting other people. See, the story of David and Goliath, it's not the story of a street fight. It's not like David and Goliath are fighting each other with only their own lives on the line. They're actually fighting this fight, and the lives of hundreds or thousands of people are on the line. And the only reason they're fighting this fight is because they have been sent by people who trust them to win. And so really, the story of David and Goliath is not the story of just one fight between a shepherd boy and a giant. It's a chess match, if you will, between the one who sent David, King Saul, the king of Israel, and the one who sent Goliath, the Philistine general. And they're operating on very different assumptions of trust. Now, on one level, the decision for the Philistines to send Goliath is obvious to us. We would probably send Goliath if we had a Goliath too. Goliath is huge, and when we're being honest with ourselves, we know that we generally send Goliaths, we choose Goliaths, we trust what Goliath represents more often than not. Goliath represents power. Goliath represents strength. Goliath represents experience. And those are the things that more often than not we trust without a doubt. So of course the Philistine general sends Goliath. But why does Saul send David? Well, at first he doesn't. Now, something to understand about, and we were going through selections of this chapter, but there's a lot of backstory that we missed, and I'll fill in some of it for you. The Israeli and Philistine armies are at a stalemate, and they've been that way for a long time. They're on opposite ends of a valley, and they're both in the hills. And so for any of their armies to move down into the valley, they'd be exposing themselves to the others who would rain down all kinds of war on them and lose. So nobody can move first. So it's the only way to solve this problem to send just one person down and minimize the risk in their place. And so we have Goliath come down into the valley and call out somebody from Israel. Now Saul knew that this was really the only way to settle this fight. He couldn't send his entire army down, they'd be decimated. And the same goes for the Philistines. So he could have decided in that moment, okay, well, I don't have a 9-foot-tall person, but who's my biggest, strongest, fastest, fiercest warrior? No doubt he had plenty to choose from. But Saul doesn't do that. In fact, he doesn't do anything. He just waits for 40 days. Now, I think that's actually pretty amazing. To decide not to make a decision is sometimes a decision in itself. And one of the ways to hedge yourself against being the kind of person who trusts too much is maybe not to just not trust, but maybe just wait and to practice patience to see what might happen. And that's the kind of leader that Saul is. That's what he does. He waits for 40 days. And then 40 days later, here comes David. Now, David is a charismatic guy, but he's just a shepherd boy. But we know at this time that he's God's anointed. And he's got some charisma. He clearly believes in himself. You've heard that. And a lot of his self-belief is tied to his own trust in God. But why should anyone trust him? Now, one of the biggest misconceptions about David is that he somehow was not a warrior at all, and that he was completely the underdog in this fight. But in order for us to understand who David was, we have to know a little bit about the context of the time. And actually, these slingers were an incredibly deadly force. I want to show a picture right now of somebody who is a shepherd boy with a sling in 1900 in ancient Palestine, well, 1900s Palestine, just outside of Jerusalem. This is an Arab shepherd boy carrying a sling. And shepherds would carry these slings in the same way that cowboys would carry guns, and they were honestly just as effective. A shepherd boy with a sling, especially if those slings were carrying little iron bullets, could get the revolutions going fast enough that the sling would shoot off a bullet faster than a fast-pitch baseball. And the result at close range was pretty similar to shooting a .45 Colt. It's not something to dismiss by any means. This isn't just a boy with a slingshot. This is somebody with a pretty serious weapon. In fact, and I'll show you the next picture, this is a picture of a relief from an ancient Trajan column that shows warriors with slings. You can kind of see someone holding that sling off on the left side. You can see him carrying it. And that's a warrior. That's somebody who's going to war with a sling. And the Israelites would have had plenty of slingers in their armies, just as the Philistines would have too. They could travel hundreds of yards, rocks thrown in slings. And David is telling people that he's pretty good at using it. He's bragging to Saul that he has killed lions and bears, so you know his shot is probably really good. So David is a fierce warrior with a pretty awesome weapon, but at the same time, he's just a boy. He's not battle-tested or battle-proven, and he's probably at this point still just a scrawny, kind of cocky kid. And so Saul is left with the decision to keep waiting for something else to happen or to put his trust in David. Well, David ends up helping make that ultimate decision for Saul with one final thing that he convinces Saul of. And this is probably the most important thing. David convinces Saul that he should trust him because their cause is righteous and that they are on God's side. And with that final argument, Saul decides to send David out against Goliath, knowing that he's sending a young, inexperienced shepherd boy, though probably pretty good with a fierce weapon, but still against a tested, proven giant of a warrior. The odds weren't very good. But in the end, we know that David triumphed. And so I think this story is trying to teach us something about how we put our trust in the world and where we pin our hopes. More often than not, we try to play things really safe. And in our view, safety means power. It means prestige. It means experience. It means might and strength. But that's often not at all how God wants us to make decisions. It's not at all how God picks winners in this world. And those who look beyond those powers, who maybe take their time, hold back on rushing to decisions, but then are willing to take that risk of going for the outside shot because it's the righteous thing to do, because they believe in the cause. That's what I think this story is encouraging us to do. So today I want you to think not necessarily of yourself as David, but as yourself as Saul. What kind of decision would you make? And whom would you pin your hopes on? We know that the world so often will pin their hopes on power, but are you willing to pin your hopes on justice and righteousness, on an outside shot from a young person who just might have a chance to do the right thing? I think that that's what this story is encouraging us to think about. Now, this is New England, and we have just ended an epic season with one of our favorite warrior teams, which is the New England Patriots. And so I would be remiss if I didn't share just one little Tom Brady story with you. Because I do think in some ways, Tom Brady, though this is all fun and games and football and not, the big things of real life, but Tom Brady's story also has a bit of David's story in it. Tom Brady was skilled, no doubt. He was not a novice, but he wasn't the most skilled. He wasn't the best at football when he first joined the Patriots. In fact, he was a sixth-round pick, and he sat on the bench most of the time. It wasn't until Bill Belichick's back was against the wall that he decided to send in Tom when Drew Bledsoe was injured. And then taking a chance on this outside shot kind of quarterback ended up changing the Patriots franchise for a very long time. And while the sun may have set on Tom Brady's time, I don't know, I'm not a prophet, it still is an important example for all of us to see what it can do and the ways that we limit ourselves and limit the potential that we have in our own lives, in our churches, in our organizations, in our communities, in our nation, and in our world, when we only trust the known, when we only trust the powerful, when we only trust the biggest and strongest and fiercest, or whether we are willing to take a chance on a scrappy fighter, on a scrappy warrior, on somebody who stands on the side of righteousness. And what might happen if we do that? What if? What if? What if? Amen.